All right. Another exciting day. At least you don't have to put up with me next Tuesday, so. Oh, and the projectors aren't on. Interesting. There we go. Nothing really deep here. Project 3 formative, if you want feedback, submit it before 11 in the morning on the 11th, even though you don't have to be here. I think it's technically set to be due today, but you can submit it until next Tuesday. See, this is malicious compliance. We've done what UBC says, which is not to assign you anything that's due on the holiday, and yet this allows you to extend it out to the holiday. LLMs are really good at this. Malicious compliance, they are surprisingly good at it. Capstone Peer Design is due next Thursday, so a week. Just to clarify, you're not designing your capstone. You're designing one of the two capstones that you reviewed. The purpose of the exercise is to get you used to the real world where someone else is going to be telling you what you're going to build. And it's probably not nearly as structured as you would get from a lesson that's been taught over a period of a dozen years here at UBC, where someone has tuned it, not because what they're trying to build is important, but because what they're trying to minimize the complexity of assessment. Now, when you're working in the real world, the complexity of assessment will not be a factor for the people who are telling you what to build. Their assessment is going to be completely external to what you do. Typically, it's going to be, does this do what our customers are willing to pay us money for? And that's always a good framing. If you start building a product, don't say, what do customers want? Don't ask that question. The right question to ask is, what are they willing to pay for? Because they want everything. It's sort of human nature. Slightly different approach here. This is a technique that appeared in an archive paper a couple of weeks ago, and it's actually an interesting one. And basically what it says is, ask an LLM not to give you an answer, but to give you a sample of the potential answers. So, an answer in LLM speak is a continuation. So you have a dialogue, they compute what is the highest probability continuation, and then they return that. Now, I say highest probability, but in fact, when you start using the API, there's this thing called temperature, which will actually say sample from things within this range. So if you say 1, you're going to get the same answer. You're always going to get the top answer. If you say a number less than that, you're going to get a sampling from those completions that are within that probability bound. So it's a number between 0 and 1. If you're looking for creative solutions, creative answers, things to actually explore, asking the question in a way that forces the LLM to generate multiple options gives you things to consider you might not have originally thought about. When they tune the large language model to answer your questions, they rely upon the rating of people who have been hired to look at a question, look at the answer, and rate it whether they liked it or didn't like it. And there is, in fact, very recent research this year, I think it was summer of this year, there's several papers on this, that basically says what those human raters prefer are things they've already seen. If you're trying to do research, the answer that was successful with a gig worker in a low-wage country probably isn't going to get you to the solution that you actually want to build a real product. What you want is to see what other possible answers were there. So, try that with, so you yes?
Is data not also gathered from everyday users? And while you might not be able to get information like which one they rated is better, you might be able to judge it by, for example, if they stop prompting after a certain question.
Actually, they do engage in A/B testing as well. But Claude Code is doing this now, where it will ask you how happy you are with Claude's answers up to that point, and I always just put 0, which is dismiss. So yes, in theory, what you're doing is you are also feeding them additional data. So that's even better because they don't have to pay for your data. They get it for free. And it's probably higher quality than the data they're paying something for. So there's a part of me that always says, I don't actually want to answer that question because I don't want to give them something for free. Maybe that's just me being stubborn. So the approach that I usually take when ChatGPT does the A/B testing, Gemini does it sometimes too, I will take the other answer, I'll just randomly pick one, take the other answer and paste it into the conversation and say, they gave me 2 options, this is the other option they gave me. I have no idea what that does to their data, but it certainly is interesting to do. That's my malicious compliance. But yeah, so even there, I suspect that, and I haven't seen studies on this yet, but I suspect that what you will find is that most people will find things that are familiar to them pleasing. Most people don't want the LLM to be challenging them, pushing them, or asking them hard questions. You want to be told that you're brilliant and smart and handsome or beautiful and that you're going to be wildly successful and that your idea is absolutely the best invention since the paperclip. And you're smiling back there because you know that's a line of bullshit. And yet, it's very easy to fall into that trap. I mean, why do you go to academia? Academics are very strange people, but they tend to be pretty cynical. Because the very act of doing research, of looking at problems from different perspectives means being able to see things that most people can't see right now. Oh, right, so this is just a comment on what the thing is. All right, so I'm not going to go through that one. I'm not going to do this as a studio today because I've got some other things planned, but I wanted to give you something different than another structured learning prompt. I use this sometimes. It's actually quite interesting, especially when I'm asking what I want to be more open-ended, researchy style questions. Maybe the question is, I want to go to some place with tropical beaches and low prices. Please give me a list of the 5 most likely completions to the where should I go question. Sometimes I say, show me the probability and explain to me the basis of that probability. I did it with Claude yesterday though, and Claude Desktop kind of refused. He says, well, I don't really have access to that kind of information. Like, come on, Claude, yes, of course you do. So I had to push it. They're very strange that way. They almost are like little petulant children sometimes. Maybe you haven't noticed that. Brilliant little petulant children. This was just clarification that the peer-reviewed design is you designing someone else's system, not your own. And what prompted this was yesterday somebody on Discord asked me about their assessment on peer review, and I realized that they were thinking that they were being graded based upon the other person's, the other student's reviews, which is not. The TAs don't actually have access to the other students' reviews when they are themselves doing their assessment. And then there seemed to be some confusion about the reflection being a reflection on their own work, and it's not. It's a reflection on the other people's work, and then on and then our evaluation is how well did you actually help the other people? In other words, do we see evidence that you engaged with what they did in a constructive fashion? Because that's the goal. When you get out into the real world and you're working with people, you need to be able to give effective feedback to them. And it's a hard skill to learn. It's very easy to fall into traps like the criticism sandwich, which is a still popular one that I've recently read basically doesn't work anymore. That's you say something nice, then you say something mean, then you say something nice again to not hurt their feelings. And it turns out that people have now figured out that this is performative theater. And so it's better to keep your feedback crisp and honest, but not turn it into a personal attack. You have ugly shoes and your code is really bad. And somebody just looked down at their shoes. I thought that was cute. My shoes are beautiful. I don't know, how many of you actually care about shoes? You see, shoes are important, right? Yeah, I know. I'm more like you, right? Whatever's cheapest. Actually, whatever fits, that's most important. Whatever fits and is comfortable. One of my PhD supervisors, she's at Georgia Tech, and I'll go to conferences, and she's always in heels. And she's wearing like Jimmy Choo's, very nice, expensive shoes. When the Birkin handbag case came up in New York City, and I was really interested in that, and I was actively talking to them about working on it, and they picked somebody else, of course. I had no idea what a Birkin handbag was. So the first person I reached out to was her. And what does she do? She sends me a picture of her daughter holding her Birkin handbag. Does anybody know what a Birkin handbag is?
Like really expensive handmade purses, I think.
Right, with limited supply. And if you are, in fact, an Hermes customer, you may have to shop with them for years before you are invited to be allowed to buy a Birkin handbag. And in the lawsuit, this was the part that got me the most, a Birkin handbag has a 17% rate of return, increase in its value over time. So literally, if you buy a Birkin handbag today, it'll be worth 17% more next year. That's like better than Vancouver real estate, especially these days. But it's very crazy. But it's an artificial scarcity too. All right. So I'm going to try and pull together a lot of the strings of the things that I've been talking about, and that is critical thinking. What is it, and why does it matter? Why is it a useful skill to have? Does anybody know what critical thinking is? Great. Well, then you're about to learn. Or at least my interpretation of critical thinking, because true critical thinking, you'd be sitting there going, how do I know what he's actually teaching me is critical thinking? In essence, it's the ability to question what you're told, what you're being asked to do, what your perception of the world is. How many of you have been to Botswana? So if somebody told you something about Botswana, you'd have no basis to know if it was true or false. Would you just trust them? Maybe. Depends on how important the fact was. How many people have ever been to the Democratic Republic of the Congo? How many of you have an iPhone? Nobody? I have one. So in the iPhone, in the construction of the iPhone, are rare earth metals that come from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And they are primarily mined by children. It's a well-known ethical issue around the production of devices in tech is that in many cases we exploit and utilize people. Now, should you take my word for that? No, but if you go ask your LLM, it'll confirm that. It's very easy for us to ignore the fact that these are made with child labor because we are very far removed from it. A lot of the discussion about ethics is not intended necessarily to change what you do, but to make you conscious of it. And part of critical thinking is that consciousness processing. How do I look at things and ask the questions I should be asking to make sure that I am making mindful decisions rather than just simply running on autopilot? And if you want to run on autopilot, make a conscious decision to do that, fine, not a problem. And of course, why would we actually want to work when I'm out in there? Okay, so right, we talked about Cambridge Analytica. Did anybody go home uncomfortable with what I talked about? Or was it just like, yeah, one more class? I actually had a hard time writing this lecture because there were parts of it that I found very uncomfortable. I mean, the Cambridge Analytica, I knew that story because I'd been exposed to it over the course of the last decade. Sometimes critical thinking is exactly the act of creating the friction necessary for you to look at and examine your assumptions about the world. Because maybe your vision of the world, your model of the world, isn't the world. Just maybe. I mean, you probably are all walking around with perfect models of the actual world in your heads. What are we defending against? In the critical thinking world, what we're defending against isn't malicious hackers or evil corporations. Well, all right, mostly, you might want to question their motivations, or even technical failures. What you're defending against are things that you do because you think they're good ideas or they have good intentions. There's a saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and there's a certain amount of truth to that. Optimization pressure is a huge one. I see it when I have people who message me about losing 2 points on an assessment. It's a min-maxing thing. You have been trained, you have been conditioned, just like an AI is. You've been conditioned to a particular objective function. Because that's what optimization is about. It's about maximizing an objective function. What is my goal? Now, maybe your goal changes. Maybe you came to university and said, I'm going to finish with an absolutely perfect grade point. I'm going to get 100% in everything. And then you didn't. So you changed your objective function. You said, well, maybe I'll be okay with 99. Okay, maybe 96. And then some people will get to the point where they're like, I just want to graduate. As long as I pass the class, I don't care. What is the correlation between grade point and success in life? Anybody know? That's a good question for your LLM. I'm not going to answer it. Invisible extraction. Why did I mention the thing about the kids mining, I think it's cobalt, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? Because I'm making something that is invisible visible. Why do I talk about the gig workers who are used to train these LLMs that we're now all relying upon? Because those companies have chosen to keep them and make them invisible. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I don't actually care about whether you don't care about whether I think it's right or wrong, and I don't care whether you think it's right or wrong. I just want you to be making conscious decisions, not unconscious ones. One of the most interesting things to protect against here is structural blindness, is you assume that the things that you know are true. You grow up and society implants ideas and concepts and norms in your head. And you just assume they're true. They affect and control your behavior. They affect and control the way that you approach the projects that you build in the tech society. Being able to question those things, being able to step back and say, are my assumptions, the things that I just take for granted, actually correct or not? Maybe I'll turn this around and ask you a question here, which is, have you ever found out something that you'd been taught was wrong? Ever? Something your parents told you that turned out to be incorrect. Something that your teacher told you that turned out to be wrong. Something that your friend told you. No? Wow, you guys have the most truthful group of family, friends, teachers, and ever. I guess I grew up in a different world, because I learned lots of things that turned out not to be true. When I was a kid, they taught us that dinosaurs were lizards. They were reptiles. What are dinosaurs? Delicious. They're delicious. Because today we call them chickens. They're birds. They're avens. But if I go watch Jurassic Park, they still look like lizards, even though they were much more closely aligned to birds. This is actually the slide I struggled with the most, and I ultimately decided to leave it blank because I've touched on this before. These are the things that we do that affect people we don't even know exist. The list of examples included things like, maybe you've heard of Facebook. Anybody ever heard of Facebook? Eventually we'll get something that you people know or are willing to admit to. Okay, a couple of heads are willing to nod. This is great. Okay, we're making progress here. Facebook has a real names policy. I haven't gone to check to make sure they still have a real names policy, but Facebook originally had a real names policy. And one of the side effects of a real names policy is it means that if someone says something about you on Facebook that you don't want people to know, they'll know it's you. They may not know if what was said was true or false, but it will associate with you. Do any of you have anything that you'd be uncomfortable if your family knew about in your life? Yeah, at least I'm getting some head nods there. Yeah, there are things that I've chosen to do that I don't think that my family would necessarily look kindly upon. Facebook's real name policy had real impact on people who really were exposed for such behaviors. And this could lead to kids who got kicked out of their homes by their parents because their parents didn't accept whatever the child was doing. Do any of you have friends who have been kicked out of their home by their parents? I see a few heads, but not very many. Everybody has secrets. Everybody has things they don't want the world to know. Even when I was looking for the video today, which does involve one of the bullets that's not on this slide, which was the gig workers. It's a very nice little YouTube video, and it's done by Al Jazeera, which is one of the reasons I picked it. I'm like, yes, that's excellent. So we don't have a Western media bias. Instead, we have a Qatari media bias. Perfect. Gives you some balance. It was, in fact, about gig workers, about the people who actually actively watch content, about the people who watch beheadings of humans so that they can be removed from YouTube so you don't have to watch them. How many of you have ever actually seen a beheading? Would it surprise you to find out that people actually post those things online? Is there anyone in here who would be surprised to find out that murders, suicides, executions, beatings have all been posted to YouTube? See, I asked that in a way that pretty much biases it, because nobody's going to raise their hand now, so that means you all know that it happens. Okay, what does this have to do with tech? What does it have to do with cloud computing? Well, that is in fact the point. YouTube is a cloud service. It is fundamentally a cloud service, and this affects everyone who allows any kind of content to be posted. So I left the slide blank. Because for me it was hard to think that the things that I do might make someone else's life a hell. And I use critical thinking in order to make sure that when I do things, I think about how it affects others, how it affects the world. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of how things can go wrong, failure modes? I already mentioned the real policy, name policy. Victims of domestic violence are often damaged by policies like this because they're trying to hide from an abuser who will pursue them. Does anybody know someone who's in an abusive relationship or has been in an abusive relationship? Or maybe you're in an abusive relationship? You have a professional knowledge of these things that most people don't. I have a friend here who's a PhD student in the department who is in an abusive relationship, and I can tell you that it is really difficult sometimes to listen to that person talk and defend their abuser. They haven't left their abuser. It's a 20-year-long abusive relationship. When people get up the nerve to leave an abusive relationship like that, the worst thing in the world that you can do is say, we need to know your real name so that your abuser can track you down and kill you. Why did I perseverate? Why did I talk about the clause control test paradigm? Why did I say, what are you going to do about personally identifiable information? And that's because it can be used in ways that you never even imagined. Okay, I've shown you the exploitative part of it because that's probably more the reality that you're living with here. But maybe at some point you're going to find yourself in a situation where someone is actively threatening your life, and because you get doxxed, you or someone in your circle dies. Anybody know any refugees? Anybody who's fled another country because of some sort of violence? Canada's a great place for those people to come. We actually have an entire system for managing that. And in fact, if you come to Canada, if you're successful in getting to Canada, you can start your refugee application by going to downtown Vancouver. It's the only office that will take the application directly. And you can buzz the buzzer, and they will take your information and take your personal information, personal statement at that time and initiate the refugee process. So again, I'm not making this stuff up. This actually does happen. It's a very difficult process. It's very hard to become accepted as a refugee. Optimization myopia is actually a very interesting one because often this is the story of how you start measuring things and how the very act of measuring something, of creating a metric to evaluate, then causes the system to pivot towards optimizing for that particular metric. I remember this from my university days when I was actually younger than you, which was a long time ago. And in political science class, they talked about how central planning economies, and they were using the Soviet Union at the time as the example, lead to perverse behaviors. And the example I still remember was the production of glass. In one 5-year cycle, they decided that they wanted to measure the production of glass in the amount of area that was covered by that glass. And so what it resulted in was glass that turned out to be too thin to survive. So in the next 5-year cycle, they switched it to being the weight of the glass that was produced. And then they ended up with thick slabs of glass because it was easier to produce a lot of glass that way. And I think it's a really simple example of how we optimize the things we build for the things that we measure. This is a really easy trap to fall into in the tech space. If we start measuring things based upon engagement, how many hours a day does our customer spend with us? What are we going to do? We're going to do things like, make AI chatbots that are a lot of fun to talk to because they're really good at giving you ego strokes. Nobody in here is doing the game development thing as far as I understand, but games tend to be focused on providing you with dopamine, with that hit that makes you feel really good. And that is a measure of their success. They are literally manipulating you in a way that is based upon the way your brain works. But what I find strange about that one is, does the company make more money if you play the game more? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Because, of course, the company, as someone pointed out very wisely a couple of lessons ago, the company is focused on making a profit. But the problem with the maxim, I just want to make money, is that it's too abstract. It's too far away from the source of the money. Because to get the money, you need to give something to someone else who has money, who will then give it to you. So probably the primary benefit of making things engaging is it means that you're less likely to stop using the service entirely. How many of you have ever heard of paper towels? Have you ever heard of the brand name Bounty? I have a friend who actually works for, I think it's Procter & Gamble, who makes Bounty. And he told me about how they decided to go to half sheets. It used to be that these were big. Now they're half as big. And do you know why they decided to do half sheets? It increased the consumption of the paper towels by a measurable amount. People used more paper towels, not less paper towels. That's a really cool optimization. Their goal wasn't to try and improve the environmental impact. Their goal was to try and improve the amount of product they could sell. And that's very much the engagement style model. How many of you actually care about the environment? Wow, I see some very, very strong convictions there. One person was willing to put his hand halfway up, and the rest were like, yeah, I guess so. I don't really care if it gets a little warmer every year, and the storms are worse, and the people in Florida don't have houses anymore because the ocean has gone up, and Richmond is part of the ocean. I mean, have you ever actually seen the charts of what Richmond looks like as the water comes up? I mean, even where I live downtown, I'm high up on the West End, so I'll be above the water line, but it'll be an island. It won't be a peninsula anymore. But Richmond's mostly underwater. The airport is underwater. Will that impact your life? Any of you plan on having children? Boy, there's a strong, definite commitment to continue to drive the Canadian fertility rate below its already low number. Right. The flaw in this thinking is that when you start measuring something, it becomes what you focus on, because now you're trying to optimize or maximize for that. So one way to look at that is to say, I need to have lots of potentially competing goals to measure against, because that way my product won't end up lopsided in one direction or another. Or another way is just to simply say, hey, all I really care about is, are the things I'm optimizing for maximizing my profit, which from a business perspective is exactly what you want to be doing. So the right way to pick your metrics is, how well does that metric correlate with increased profit? The adjacent possible. In other words, the idea that you come up with this really cool new idea and someone else figures out how to use it in a way that is similar to the way that you envisioned, but isn't the way that you envisioned, and might not be something you would have wanted it to do. The Facebook name policy is an example. The Graph API, we'll go back to pick on Facebook now. So the Graph API, which is how we managed in the Cambridge Analytica example to harvest 800 million profiles. 800 million. I mean, that's like 10% of the entire population of the Earth now. Does anyone know what the population of the Earth is? What is it?
8 billion or so.
It's just over 8 billion. Does anybody know what the first derivative is? The rate of increase is actually slowing down, and the second derivative is slowing down even more. Before the pandemic, the most optimistic estimates were that the population of the Earth would hit about 11 billion before it starts going down. Now the numbers, even the most optimistic, are below 10 billion. So we're rapidly approaching the point at which the population of the Earth will start decreasing. When you look at the heat map, it's very interesting. About the only place that you can go to that has a positive fertility rate, i.e. the population is still growing, is in parts of Africa. And not even all of Africa, parts of Africa. And it's slowing down as well. If you look at China, you look at North America, you look at Central America, South America, so most of Asia, actually I think all of Asia now, or very close to all of it, all of Europe, the fertility rates are now below sustainability. Kind of interesting. So I'm going to do the first of the exercises I promised, almost a halfway hour into this thing. Take 4 minutes and write down something in your own capstone project idea. Or if you want, you can pick one of the projects you've already done. That's fine too. That is a way your project could be used that might be harmful, but that wasn't part of your original design thought. So I'm just asking you to engage in this simple process of saying, how could somebody use this in a way that I hadn't really thought about now. You're putting on your black hat, your adversarial hat, on your own work. Or pick somebody else's work, it's fine. Take 4 minutes, think about that, write something down, and then we'll caucus on that.
Well, I guess that's what most these AI things do. Just use the just wrap up ChatGPT.
You don't have to move. I'm just here causing trouble.
Okay.
Me too.
Try to put some negative feelings.
All right. So, who was not able to come up with something that was an unintended use case for the project of your choice? This is a trap you're walking into, right? Because if you don't say that you didn't find one, then I'm going to call on you and ask you what you did find. All right? So who wants to volunteer something they thought of as a way that the project they picked? What did you find? What did you find?
Didn't find anything.
You didn't find anything, but you didn't say that you didn't find anything when I asked. Are you paying attention?
Really.
Okay. At least he's honest. What did you find?
So for my project, I'm doing like a natural language to SQL kind of thing, so people can upload their own data sets and non-technical people can like query their data.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I think if the user had a really ambiguous like request and it kind of got mistranslated into SQL that doesn't really reflect the actual meaning of what they want, then they could get like results that don't actually answer the question and could be misleading.
So the user could ask a poorly formed question, which would then lead you to generate an answer that was not very useful to the user.
Or it could be misleading, like they thought that it was
Misleading to a user. That's interesting. Okay, so your concern is that you want the result to be truthful or beneficial to the user. Okay, that's really cool. I like that. Thank you. Anybody else? I'm picking on the loners today, so. What did you come up with? Yeah, you're sitting there all by yourself.
I mean, I guess the biggest thing with the project's like batch media processing mainly, so like there's no control over what people upload really. Someone could decide that they want to upload something that's illegal in whatever jurisdiction. There's nothing really like checking to make sure that what's going in is kosher.
Here's an interesting story because I actually read it yesterday and it kind of amazed me. So this was a security researcher, or he was a researcher that had downloaded a known research data set that contains no CSAM, but that Google decided contained CSAM. And apparently this is not an unknown problem because of the titles of the files themselves. And they suspended his account. And when they suspend your account, they suspend everything. And so an interesting a side effect, an unexpected harm here is that by automating things like content analysis and assuming that the test paradigm itself is always correct and having no other way for someone to correct the record, you could basically destroy their work. His case was particularly interesting because he appealed it twice, it was denied twice, then it was granted, and while he was looking at the data, he didn't change anything, he was just looking at the data to see what it was that they had removed, they suspended his account again. So that's a great example, and it tied into this article. I actually thought enough of that article, I marked it, and I said I really should make sure I post that someplace because I thought it was an interesting story. And it's not different in many ways than the story I told earlier, which is most people never even appeal their YouTube removals, and of the people who do appeal, most of them don't win. So one of the real dangers is, and I saw this in a terms of service today, the service is the sole arbiter of what is and is not allowed content. So they can take your money and then prohibit you from using the service because you violated a term that was so vague that you wouldn't have even known. And the best part is then, of course, the cap on their liability is as much as you paid them. So there's no economic benefit for you to try and recover it, because the cost of going after it is higher than the actual maximum you could get. I'll pick on the last person who's sitting alone. So what did you find?
Just to confirm, this is regarding the capstone?
I opened it up so you can make it any project, but I was talking about, my initial suggestion was yes. What in your own capstone pitch project?
We briefly spoke in office hours about
Yep.
capstone
how to spend the money.
Spending money pretty much, and usually it's like some sort of collective fund.
Strata councils.
Could be. Actually, that'd be an interesting application. But one of the downsides with that would be that it might enable like a popularity contest where people would like engage in social media, or organizations which have access to networks might like flood towards a certain option, which would sort of
Manipulation.
yeah.
Interesting, interesting. So that would create an unintended consequence. Was that something you hadn't thought about before?
No, I've thought about a lot of aspects about it, but
Good.
I think there'd be some aspect of like weighted voting, which can get complicated, quadratic voting perhaps, or maybe only trusted, authorized users, or something like that. But yeah, there's a lot of layers.
Let's talk about the how do you boil a frog without it jumping out of the pot failure. And that is normalization. And we see this in the world in which we live, where a behavior violates a norm, but it doesn't stop. So then what happens is it becomes normalized. The norm changes. So what we used to not tolerate now becomes tolerable. In Mexico, apparently, it's acceptable to grope the president of the country. Obviously, no one reads the news. Claudia Sheinbaum was groped. Day before yesterday, I think. There's actually been an interesting outrage over it. And I thought about that and I said, you know, if she hadn't been the president of Mexico, it probably wouldn't have actually even drawn anybody's notice other than maybe the immediate people affected. So maybe the groper didn't have good judgment to decide not to go for somebody who might actually have power over him. There's a couple of women in here. Have any of you ever been touched inappropriately? That's a very difficult question to ask. How about the men? Have any of you ever been touched inappropriately? In a way that made you uncomfortable? I mean, I'm pretty sure the women are just not saying it because most women have experiences of this type. It used to be that it was very difficult to get pornographic content. I don't know if anybody has noticed, but OpenAI has now said that adult content will be coming to ChatGPT. Why? Money. Slow normalization is an approach to how you boil frogs. It is the idea that you don't turn the heat up too fast. You just do it a little bit at a time. There's another term for this from an old movie. It's called gaslighting, where we just slowly turn the light down and tell you you're going blind. Because the change is so gradual and so small, you don't notice it. So that's the reason that I went through and I said, where do you start? You start with a link shortener and you turn it into a tool for tracking people. When we started with Study Circle, we started with this very strong constitution, then we realized we needed to monetize it, so we weakened it a little bit and we allowed advertising and we allowed some use of personal profiles. And then, does anybody remember what the last thing I suggested was? I suggested adding a personality profile because that would make it easier for us to actually match you with compatible study partners. Does that seem reasonable? Could we do anything else with that personality profile besides match you to other study partners? But we normalized it. Every time the company changes the terms and conditions, and you get those announcements, and it says if you keep using our service after this date, you agree to these terms and conditions, or you have to agree before you can move forward. And it's, of course, 495 pages of very small legalese, and no one reads it. What they're doing is normalizing the changes. You just accept it and you move on. Another short reflection this time. I brought paper. I didn't bring pens. I only brought paper. I want you to write down on this piece of paper. I don't need very many sheets. I brought a lot, but I knew that there would only be a few people anyway. Which of these failure modes are you most susceptible to? Write it down, but it's private. I brought a garbage bag too, so that I can dispose of them when we're done. Hand one down, please. I didn't bring enough. I'll get more. The second exercise is great because if nobody wants to talk about what they wrote down, you guys can just simply sit there and stare at each other in silence. It's delightful. So the reason to have you write it down is that makes it very real. It turns it from an abstract exercise to something that you're consciously and actively doing. And you can just put a doodle on there if you want. I don't care. I know there's 2 sheets there. There we go. And everybody does have pens. I was like, maybe people don't carry pens anymore. Because you can just record everything. I would never record everything. You guys let me get away with anything. Let me set a timer too. All right. So take your piece of paper that you may or may not have written something on and fold it over so it's private to you. I'm not asking you to share it with anybody else. And now talk to people around you, make a small group, that's fine. And if you want to share that as part of the discussion, that's great too. The goal is to spend 5 minutes and talk about what makes these failures easy to fall into. And it's not on the slide, but I'd ask you to think about how do you stop yourself from falling into them. This is tough for the loners. You don't have to. You can just sit there and talk to yourself if you want. Talk to ChatGPT. It's fine. It'll tell you that you're a wonderful person and that everything you do is perfect. And then you put it in brutal honesty mode and it will tell you the truth, or its version of the truth.
This is really good paper. It's like satisfying.
I try to use good paper because life is too short for shit paper. You know, the stuff where it bleeds through and you can see on the other side and you're like, really? And it's pretty much the same price. So it's like, you know, there's more to life than just simply saving money. Sometimes it's worth paying for a better product.
Yeah, I don't know. I find good paper satisfying.
You know, good paper is just one of those good things in life. It's kind of like a good meal,
Yeah.
right? Where
No, a good meal isn't.
I need to make some cookies and bring them in. I'll give cookies to people who raise their hands. That will suddenly have everyone raising their hands. Because then there will suddenly be an incentive, and there's that objective function of feeding hunger. And you'll have the cookies, and you'll go, wow, I want another one. And the best part is I don't sell the cookies, I just give them away. I've given so many cookies away. And I don't buy them, I actually make them.
The unintended consequence of someone has a food allergy.
It sucks to be them.
Yeah. That's the empty chair.
It is the empty chair, and I do think about it, and I'm like, they're not really suffering.
They just get to watch other people eat cookies.
Well, they can also watch the people who didn't raise their hands, who didn't get cookies. So, let's see.
Yeah.
An interesting observation about food allergies is that the way that so peanut allergies in children has been a problem, and they figured out how to get rid of it
By introducing small amounts of peanuts.
early on. You start feeding them peanuts when they start eating food. Yeah, food allergies are very strange that way, and it's kind of counterintuitive to think of it that. But it's kind of like, I wonder if they could do that with latex as well, like, because there are places where you can't take latex balloons because people have like severe allergies to latex. I have a friend who can't eat mustard because they're allergic to mustard. It just makes them violently ill. You know, like throat closes up and stuff. It's, yeah. And then I know people who basically don't believe people when they say they have food allergies and try to feed them the food to see if they really do. And I'm like, that's just a little fucked up. But
That's how you get sued.
yeah, well, you know what the antidote to getting sued is, or the preventative of getting sued is? Don't own anything. If you don't have anything, they don't have anything you can get. Because lawyers don't work for free. Believe me, I spoke to some yesterday. I'm hoping that case comes through. It'll be fun.
What type of case is it?
A couple of employees left a company with some information about how the company engaged in financial trading and then built a new company. Actually, well, in the complaint, and I'm not saying it's true or false, but in the complaint, they said they actually started the company before they left. So, I mean, they're going to fight this out. They're going to see, because this is what lawyers actually do. They use an adversarial process to try and figure out what is some reasonable version of the truth. And then most of the time what happens is there's money that changes hands and people go on their separate ways.
Yeah.
Because the actual risk of trial, it's crazy. It doesn't make sense to go to trial.
Yeah.
Suing people is definitely for the rich. I mean, lawyers charge anywhere from $600 or $700 an hour to a couple thousand an hour. All right, so did anybody learn anything from that activity? See, this is me checking my optimization function, which is making sure that I give you things that allow you to learn. So if you're not learning something from it, I just can stop doing this. Was this a beneficial activity? Did you get anything out of the exercise? I mean, he's not paying attention, so he wasn't going to get anything out of it whether I did it or not. So I can dismiss him, right? He's the empty chair. Except he's not empty, mostly. Nope. Was the activity useful? I see a head and not really. Okay. Sounds like the consensus is don't do this again. Fair enough. And I'm going to stop here because I have a lot more to say and I'm not going to push it into this. I mean, when I first looked at this, it was only going to be a few slides and it turned into 28. So we're about halfway through, so I'll just use the rest of it for next Thursday. Because I won't see you on Tuesday, and I hopefully will see you on Thursday.